We love her so much. She's the founder of the MJ Universe. She's amazing all over the world, and especially in Germany. Let's hear it for Lisa Haag.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this panel on creating learning system and best practices for the global cannabis industry. Let's have a warm welcome for our panelists. Today, we have on this panel Deepak Anand, and you potentially know him. He's been in the cannabis industry for a very long time. Just one second, sorry, here. He's a principal at the ASD consultancy service as business strategy company focused on consulting businesses in alcohol, tobacco, pharmaceutical, CPG industries. Deepak's experience spans in a decade of cannabis industry, including as an operator and advisor to companies in North America, Europe, Africa, and Asia. And he also actively contributes to patient advocacy and as a vice chair at Medical Cannabis Canada, and is also involved in the advancement of a global standard within the cannabis sector as a member of the ASTM. That's an association that's working with global standards. Then I'm pleased to have Dr. Shauna Vreek here on my panel. She's the head of research and toxicology at True Terpenes. She received a PhD studying chemistry of vaping and developing a toxicology program to review all the ingredients used in True Terpene products. Additionally, she actively contributes to the advancement of global standards, also with ASTM. And then I also have here on the panel John Slaughter, CEO and founder of North High. Since 2016, High North, has worked with over 900 cannabis companies around the world and performed over 460,000 tests on cannabis. And for the past 3 years, High North has been recognized as the Analytical Laboratory of the Year in Canada. So a round of applause for the panelists. And before we dive into this, let's have a little bit of a look into what a learning system is. A learning system is a system that allows you to create, manage, organize, and deliver knowledge. So, as we all know, education and educating on the cannabis plant is one of the key factors of success for our industry. And also maybe just as a good example for a learning system is the ICBC itself, because it's a place where people can actively engage and cultivate their knowledge. So I'm very excited for our panel today, and my first question of the day goes to Deepak. Deepak, can you go a little bit, maybe explain to the audience what kind of learning systems currently exist in the cannabis industry, what is missing, and why are learning systems so important to accelerate sustainable growth?
Yeah, look, I mean, thanks for having me, and thanks for putting this together. I think that just to step back, I think education and learning is so important. I think as countries start to legislate and legalize cannabis, both for medical and non-medical purposes, I think it's really, really important to have knowledge sharing and information and education. There is a lot of education. There's a lot of people that need to be educated, everyone from regulators to stakeholders to shareholders to doctors to literally every single part of the value chain. So what exists now, I mean, there's a lot that's happening across the world, right? So I think often when you stay in Europe, you forget that there's a number of countries, Canada, the US, that have gone down the path of legalization and have a lot of experience in this. And so there's a lot that is actually available in terms of educational content. There's a number of programs on a variety of different sections of the value chain, whether it be cultivation, extraction, testing, processing. There's a lot that's available. So it really depends on which market you're focusing on, and it's not a one-size-fits-all solution, but there is quite a bit that exists. So I think the perfect system is really blending what exists with what's different about a market that you might be in.
Thank you. So let's move over to Shauna. Shauna, one of the things that people often mix up are standards and regulations. Can you maybe explain a little bit what the difference is? And can you also maybe comment is there a global cannabis standard, or is it just like a set of interpretations of regulations?
Yeah, so very oftentimes when we are talking about standards, a lot of the partners or other cannabis industry members are concerned that these standards are going to become regulations, and they're very confused on what the difference is. A standard is just a way of doing something. A lot of times they can be like bare minimum requirements, and sometimes they can be more than that, but a lot of times they're very voluntary, and a lot of times there are things that you're already doing. It's just directing you to do it a certain way over another one. So, a great example is there's a standard for the shape that a stop sign should be, right? That's not specifically written into a law, like every stop sign has to be a hexagon, it has to be this shade of red, but it's written into a standard. So a city is already creating stop signs, so might as well create a stop sign that's the same as the city next to them, that's the same as the state or country that borders them. So that's kind of how standards are implemented, right? It's just like cohesion across different locations, so everyone can kind of understand it.
Do you see a lot of defragmented rules for that, or is it like one harmonized standard that you also see develop, or can we maybe talk also about the segments a little bit?
So I think right now it's very disjointed because cannabis is a very new industry. We haven't been around for very long, like as a regulated industry, where if you look at other industries, like ceramics or construction, they have standards that everyone follows, but they've been around for over 100 years. So it does take time for these cohesive standards to get created. A great platform that is creating them is ASTM, which Deepak and I are both a part of, and anyone can become a member of ASTM. It's also a very low cost of entry, which is great. And all the members contribute to standards, so you have to get buy-in from consumers and from industry manufacturers, and there's even regulators that join. So it's a very valuable platform to get cohesive buy-in so that we will all be following the same standards in the future.
But for different areas.
Yeah, it's all broken down into different areas.
Yeah. So, John, where do you see the testing standards moving globally? Which countries have good testing standards, which do not, or may need some improvement? And for which segments of the cannabis industry do you think standards are most important to be set?
First of all, thank you for inviting us here to Canada, from Canada here, to be able to speak the European market. It's, as we look at it, Deepak talked about it right there. Go and get a license right now. You now have a German medicinal license. Your cannabis is probably coming from Canada. And it was probably tested through High North, and I probably have the COA. So we're seeing these standards as they go around the world and change. For us in Canada, we have 17 pharmacopoeias we test to. That's because all the countries around the world, in fact, aren't going together. They're actually drifting apart. If we look at the difference between sending something to Israel or something to Australia, the difference in not only the pharmacopoeia but the testing needed are drastically further apart. And I don't think, for me in Canada, it's fine because I can be this Swiss Army knife that can be whatever you need it to be and export to every country. But I really don't think the regulators have really thought about and taken a step back to say, I want to make really strict guidelines for cannabis for this country. It's like, great, but now not one lab in your entire country can actually test to those standards without millions of dollars of investment during a time in which it's in its infancy and nobody's going to want to do that investment. So you've almost hamstrung every single one of these cultivators that's trying to get this 2 million square foot operation off the ground using a lab that they can barely get access to, that they're getting data back from, that they question every time, that's often like 25, 30 days later than they need to be getting it. And it's those regulations seem smart off the bat, but just adding something like bromide to your pesticide testing, that just caused a $1.5 million investment to whatever laboratory now has to test that. That's because you're doing a second run, you're using another LCMS, your most expensive machine is now being run. And if you think about how important a laboratory is, especially in those early days, that's your dashboard of your car. Every morning you get in your car, the speedometer, as people know in Canada, it might say it's 80, you're actually driving 62. And you need to think about that calculation because my labs always give me back THC scores that are higher. It's like coming in and every single one of the lights being on in your car and you just ignoring those lights. Well, those lights could be hop latent virus spreading across your entire facility, but if the lab is giving you back results saying it's clean, It's clean, and there you go, you press on. Not having that data, I think it not only, it seems like a good idea, it seems like you've added good standards, but what you've really done is you've limited the laboratories and literally blinded the growers. And I think it's just, you're set up to cause the longest curve to be able to get up and actually get functional in that market. Not happening. Plain and simply not happening. And if you want to talk about where this goes bad, it's the legacy market taking over. It's products coming in that are 100% untested, because the only ones that are hitting people's hands that are actually being smoked are not from your legal market. So you feel like you've added good standards, but what you've really done, you've lagged the legal clean industry, and you've given a jump start to the backside of the industry. The worst example is the Netherlands. Love to dunk on them for this, because go into any place in there, any coffee shop, you feel like what you're getting is good weed, whatever, it might be good weed, it's not tested. It's plain and simply not tested. And every single place you go to, none of that stuff is tested. So great place to go for vacation and smoke some weed, but your pesticides could be off, there could be heavy metals, there could be aflatoxins, you have no idea.
I think it's a requirement for the new cannabis that is provided through the pilot programs that they do testing. Yeah, but I agree with the cannabis that is from illicit sources.
And the thing is, right now, if you look at past, 20, 30 years, if you've been going to a coffee shop in Amsterdam, you're smoking 100% untested cannabis.
I mean, we're talking about also different areas where standards and testing standards like become relevant for cultivation, for manufacturing, for all those kind of things. So I know that they have been discussing global medicinal cannabis standards in the International Narcotic Control Board in 2021, but I have not personally seen a lot of development. So Shauna, who is really developing the global cannabis standards? Are we as an industry developing those? Are the regulators, who are the people really developing the cannabis standard?
So the people that are currently developing standards have been the regulators. There are, global standard groups like ASTM that I mentioned, but those standards take time. Because it's such a thorough process. So they take time to come to place. Do I think regulators are the best people to create standards? No. Oftentimes we see regulators don't have a lot of knowledge on the cannabis industry, nor do they have any firsthand experience in the cannabis industry. And so I think we're going to see a lot of regulators are writing laws that are oftentimes different than what has already been in place in other countries or other states. They think, oh, we can do it better. They saw pitfalls here, and they're like, let me try it differently. So I think what we might see in the future is regulators try what they think is best. It doesn't work out. They realize it takes time for them to admit that maybe I don't know what's best, and then they'll direct to these global standards. And ASTM is one, but I know there's other ones. I don't know if Deepak, if you know the other ones.
Yeah, I think from a European perspective, it's important to understand, right, so far there's been no single monograph even on flower, right? And it's been a long time coming. I know now there's a lot of work that's going into creating, a monograph just on flower. So there certainly seems to be more harmonization occurring. I mean, that's the whole fundamental of the European Union generally. So it's unfortunate that we still see very much a country-by-country approach within Europe. And that's, one of the biggest challenges, because if you're a cultivator in Canada or Portugal or anywhere, and you're trying to service, Denmark, Poland, Germany, and the UK, you have 4 completely different set of regulations that you need to follow, just because there's no harmonization of regulations or even a monograph, right? So I think having a monograph, which now there's a lot of work happening at the European Union level, and finally, hopefully, we'll see a monograph on flower, but those sorts of things actually need to happen, because it creates a lot of pressure on the supply chain, right? So for example, you look at Denmark, no one's supplying to Denmark really now, because at one time there was a lot of hype, but really if you understand the Danish regulations, you actually need to reverse engineer your cultivation room to be able to exclude certain pesticides, as an example, to be able to sell into that market. So there is a real requirement for harmonization. Unfortunately, in the EU, I do agree with Shauna, regulators aren't necessarily the best placed, but unfortunately in the EU, the way things work is it is regulator driven. But there's a lot of companies now that are giving feedback to the European Union on flower, and I think more of that actually needs to happen.
The next question would have been also in that regard. I have my background in facility management. For me, it's every light switch has a code basically, and everything is standardized. So coming into the cannabis industry, I saw that there are not many standards. And I mean, also from your experience as an entrepreneur, we often see. Do you also see that like these pharmacological regular standard systems, like too many, they're a book of 7 seals that have to be learned and understood?
Don't make sense, right? Like, for example, you look at Switzerland, this whole organic requirement on cannabis cultivation. There's certain things from a regulatory perspective. It isn't clear what the regulators were thinking when they were going to start to launch these products. Oftentimes they're self-serving, but like that is definitely part of the challenge. Is that regulations sometimes are shaped in a way that aren't necessarily fostering to cannabis as a product, because yes, it's a pharmaceutical product in some instances, but it's not exactly the same as tobacco or the same as pharma. It's a unique kind of plant, and it needs a unique set of regulations sometimes.
And that's one of the things on the testing side, you see that all the time. You could grab any one of the tests, heavy metals, for example. It says use a pharmacopoeia for your heavy metals and justify it. Okay, there are 10. So am I going to go the high side, the low side? It is how many grams per day am I doing? Am I using tea as my analogy and saying, well, it's like tea. Well, how many grams of tea am I having in a day equivalent to cannabis? Therefore, what would that be for my heavy metals? Then as you take that and go to export, the broker might say, no, actually, I want it 1/10 that because I'm taking that 10 grams instead of 1. You're giving, because of the lack of like nailing down these things that Deepak was getting into, you've literally put it back into the industry as a question that the broker essentially has to handle, because they're the one that has to get it into the country. So they'll go back to the Health Canada person and go like, so is it this, is it that? Okay, yeah, guess what, guys, you're testing zinc now and it needs to be over this level. It's like, okay, well, I guess we're testing zinc now, right? So it really is, it is so fluid right now, and it's not really, that fluid is going in absolutely all directions.
I mean, it's interesting that you say that, because we have that discussion here a lot for the clubs in Germany. Is it going to be food standard? Is it going to be pharma grade standard or agricultural standard that we're sticking, or will we have our own solution? How important are analytical testing standards, especially for the start of the legalization? And maybe what are some lessons learned that we can take here when lobbying for those causes? What is important and what criteria should be used?
I think it's to kind of build on that point there of pharmaceutical, cannabis is a living plant. It's going to have microbes on it. So if you try to go, no microbials, no nothing on top of this thing's going to be a dead plant, you're laying down irradiation. If you've done that, you've now created a whole other industry of irradiation that needs to be coming up out of this, wherever you are. If it's whatever country you're in, you now not only need labs to be putting in massive money to be investing into more testing standards, but now all of a sudden you're adding irradiation facilities all the way across your place so that you could be close to an irradiation facility to get it down to zero microbes so you can get it out the door. Some of these things just plain and simply don't make sense. And I think it's because we have to go back to a pharmacopoeia that makes sense to us. But inside of that, you're like, 98% of that pharmacopoeia makes sense, but 2% doesn't. But that's the best one I can go with right now. Until there really is one that matches cannabis, you are setting people up to grow in completely different standards. And this is one of the things that I worry about when I hear, a top Canadian grower has just moved over to wherever, new country of whatever it is. To some of them, it's like you've taken an F1 racer that was in an F1 car and you just dropped him into a Lada with all the gauges flashing, and you're saying, be an F1 racer. It's like, buddy, the gauges aren't working, the track looks different, how do you expect me to be the F1 racer that I want me to be, right? So that definition really does, it sets the cannabis facilities, especially the growers, up for failure day one. Absolutely day one.
If I can just add one more piece to what John said, I think, you look at irradiation, even as one example, in Europe, you need to comply with, safety for inhalation, which is typically on the monograph 5.1.4, and there's different ways to reach that, right? So in Germany, for example, if you're trying to sell a product with that compliance, you you need to irradiate, and then you need to be able to get something called an AMRAD 5 or an AMRAD 5 license, and that takes, anywhere from 9 to 12 months to be able to get. But now people are actually trying to see ways to get around that process, and some people are using steam, some people are using a variety of different things, and it leads to non-compliance in some cases, and actually fooling the regulator in some cases. So really, you're not creating best standards for the industry because people are just trying to figure out how to get around 5.1.4.
They're not best practices, but best workarounds.
Exactly, exactly.
And that exact, literally, you literally nailed on that inhalation one. It's a perfect one. Even if you could create a cannabis operation that could work under this legally, great, you're under it. Who's going to want that product around the rest of the country? So great, you've created something that only your local market's going to want to consume, and it's never going to be exported to every country because you're going to go to other countries and you're going to compete against people that aren't using inhalation as their monograph, which means that the product's not going to be irradiated, which means it's going to get to you faster, it's going to be fresher, it's not going to be as dried out. Like, there's a lot of little things. Even if you said my irradiation barely even degrades my product, it's still added 6 weeks to everything, and 6-week-old weed is still 6-week-old weed, and it's not like it was handled well during that process. It's going to be a degraded product on the global market versus other people that don't have to sit under that standard. Again, you're setting your country up to fail.
Yeah, and what they're talking about is essentially unintended consequences, right? Regulators come in, they say something, and they don't have an understanding of the big picture. So like John mentioned, adding bromide to it, or maybe lowering an action limit of something. And they don't understand that means now the lab has to redo their whole analytical methods. Maybe they need to get new analytical instruments, and then they're farther and farther behind from providing compliant products to consumers. And the whole idea behind best practices and learning systems should be to allow consumers to participate in the regulated marketplace. That should be the goal, and oftentimes they don't match that goal.
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, Shauna, you are also working with terpenes a lot. In the German pharmacopoeia, cannabis is basically THC and CBD, and that's it. Should terpenes and other cannabinoid contents also play a more vital role in this, or would they limit us?
I would say terpenes and other cannabinoids, they play a role in the product and consumers' choices and consumer experience of the product. But I wouldn't want to see regulators come in and try to regulate based on those materials. It's very complex. There's a lot of compounds in there. And, regulators will more often than not get things wrong. But what I'd love to see is for manufacturers to take a voluntary approach and do terpene analysis and maybe list the top 3 or the top 5 terpenes on the product packaging. And that just allows the consumers to have more information and to make a choice that fits better with what experience they're going for.
Deepak, what are some other lessons learned for, especially in that regard?
Yeah, I think I would take this back, right? I think often regulators are looking at THC and CBD because it's the big thing, but not looking at what consumers actually want. And if you look at what consumers want, the trend is towards CBG and CBN and THCV and a variety of other new cannabinoids, right? And so consumers are always going to get that, whether it be from the legacy or the legal market, right? So I think it's very important when framing cannabis regulations to understand that this is very much a process and not an event. So you as a regulator need to keep on top of what's happening in the industry and be able to go through that process and improve and be able to add other cannabinoids. So I don't necessarily think regulating them to the same level is necessarily the best thing because there's different risks with different cannabinoids. You'll see workarounds in HHC, which is a really hot topic in Europe now. Yeah, exactly. So I mean,
Don't get me started. Oh,
you have to keep on top of consumer trends and be able to give consumers what they want because otherwise they're just going to get it somewhere else.
That is a perfect example of a workaround. HHC and all the rest of these things, you have forced people to play with wacky chemistry to be able to get to something that delivers the same in the end. You have just, inside of that process, you have introduced new chemicals that are not being tested. They're flying through the product. Tell me that HHC product, if it was truly created at HHC, it's going to have additional analytes inside of it. You've just essentially added something to a very natural and gorgeous product. So, no.
I agree.
Under no circumstance, no. Thank you. Preach.
So maybe as a last question before we open the floor for the audience is to all of you. How can we as the industry enable more learning systems, and how can we actively engage in the development of standards, and why should we be motivated as stakeholders to actively engage? Maybe start with you, Shona.
I think the first step of creating learning systems is to share your information. I know this is like a for-profit industry, and so you want to kind of keep your secret sauce to yourself, but the only way to educate regulators or create these learning systems, educate consumers, et cetera, is to share the information that you have. Like, there's a lot of knowledge. People have been working with cannabis for decades, before the regulated market came to play. And so there's knowledge that needs to be shared and accessible. A lot of information is hidden behind paywalls, unfortunately. So I think it would be great if people created like a database that had these, PDFs to these papers that are typically hidden behind paywalls to be accessible to everyone. That'd be fantastic.
But many scientists also hand out the papers if you contact them. Usually
that
they give
true.
you the
yeah.
paper.
Yeah, I've done that. I've direct emailed professors and said, hey, can you send me your paper? And almost every single time they do, no problem.
So Deepak, what do you think? How can we create better learning systems for the cannabis industry?
Yeah, look, I think it's all about working together, right? I think what happens and what I see in this industry particularly is people start to get competitive very quickly. And meanwhile, we haven't even started, scratching the surface with respect to where this plant is and where regulations are. I think we can all agree that the cannabis industry is only going to grow from here, where we are at today in 2024. It's very much the start of the industry as opposed to, being a mature phase. There's going to be way more consumption of cannabis that occurs on a global basis. So we got to be able to work together as an industry. I agree with Shauna completely. There are certain competitive aspects, but if you're not going to start to engage regulators and not going to start to create a learning management system and education platforms and share information, it's just going to make everyone's job harder, particularly the regulator. And when you're coming forward as an industry, you need to have a collective, collaborative voice so that you're able to make meaningful change with regulators, because the last thing regulators want to see is an industry that's disjointed and not speaking from a single voice. So I think it's very important to share learnings with each other and actually be able to have conversations like this and others to be able to bring out that information.
Yeah, I always say we need trust, honesty, collaboration, THC. So
I'm using that. Nobody else heard that from Canada. I'm using that. It's funny that when I think about the groups that I've seen historically that have put together some of these regulations, there's someone from the lab side on pharma, useless. The two analytes go inside of a pharmaceutical product, the excipient and the drug. It's the easiest thing in the world to test. Wrong person to be on that panel. There should be one person in a hoodie. I'm sorry. That there should be a master grower from somewhere that is in a hoodie that gets it, that has been there growing it for 20 years. If there's not one person at the table in a hoodie, guy or girl, I've seen amazing female growers out there, there should be one. Because that is the one side of this that I think when you get to the end of these regulations, you go, this is the reg I want, and then go back to zinc, and they'll go, but every plant has zinc. So let's just throw that law in the garbage. Every plant has microbials. So, it would be good to take these regulations, go back to a grower and say, show me you can grow this before I tell the world that this is the regulation. Show me. You're an amazing grower. I have no doubt in your skills. You're so tuned in. You have a great operation. Prove to me you can grow to this standard. Because right now, if you can't, I have literally created the impossible scenario that nobody could grow into. So that's the one thing I think we do have a rich group of people inside of over the world that I've talked to. And I'll tell you, every once in a while, I'll have a conversation with somebody that starts, in a weird tangent. And by the time you're done, you're like, that's brilliant. I don't know how that has never come to light, and how do I bring you to this conversation, because you've gone down a path for 25 years growing outdoors in this scenario with this and that, and you found ways of getting everything to work. You need to be a part of this conversation. So more hoodies at the round table, that'll help.
Yes.
So, yes, Ngayo.
I'm right here. Let's hear it for our panelists, first of all.
Wait, question, yeah. Questions?
Do you have a question?
No, the audience.
I see this person has their hand up right
yes,
now.
Misha,
I always tell people all the time, if you're a suit, find a hippie. If you're a hippie, find a suit.
Correct.
And then we can all work together.
Yep. It's everybody all at once.
Thank you.
Hold it close to your face.
Yes, sir. One of the things I want to ask is, we're speaking about, for example, the STM and teaching, a teaching platform. And what John just said earlier, you need somebody in a hoodie. But there's a disconnect between the industry and the consumer. There's also, not everybody speaks cannabis. Okay, police don't. Some doctors don't speak cannabis. So, is there a way other than just teaching growers or the regulators? I'm sorry. On what steps or what they need to take into account for the regulation to go through. As far as you need to have everybody, not just somebody in a hoodie. You need somebody in the police department. You need, yes, you do need pharma, but you also need a priest. I would love the Pope to say cannabis is okay, and it's just a domino effect. But that's another subject for another day. What are your thoughts on that?
I would like to get high with the Pope. We could solve a lot of problems.
I think what you kind of get back to this big problem that we talk about in Canada, which is removing the stigma. And I think, if you want to say where does the removal of the stigma start? It starts with you and you and you and you and you and you and you. It starts with telling your grandma she should be taking CBD oil. It goes to that person who can't sleep at night. You know what? CBN really works really well. I think keeping that conversation and keeping it a serious conversation at that level helps for that kind of remove the stigma. How you get to the Pope, I'll throw that down the panel because I myself am not a religious person, so I don't know much, but there you go.
Yeah. I mean, in general, it's super important that we, I always say, the people who have the money should give the money to the people who do the work, aka your local activists. So you should all support, also engage in those kind of initiative who engage, and people who do the education, like Misha, and maybe support some of those activities, and that we can really see where the information gets into the system, and so we can create the learning systems at all.
Yeah, if you look at the nutraceutical industry, a new nutraceutical comes out every couple years, but it takes 7 years before people are like, you know what, curcumin actually works. It actually works. But curcumin and turmeric have been around here for 20 years. Curcumin was isolated about 10 years ago inside of products. Even that product that has no stigma before it actually sinks in and people go, yeah, it works, it takes a very long time. And I think the patient side of it and the kind of the constant hit of water is, water defeats rock, not by being strong, but by being consistent. So, and I think that's kind of the path we need to take here as we look at that stigma and breaking that down.
I think just sharing personal stories is so valuable. I come up here and I talk about regulations and safety and all that jazz, but what really hits home is hearing stories of how cannabis has helped people. So share your story, and that'll encourage the next person to share their story, and that's how it spreads, and that's how you get buy-in from all different groups of individuals.
Can I just make a counterpoint to that? I think, education is more about, teaching and learning, and I think as much as we need to be teaching, which I agree with, I think we also need to be learning. We know that cannabis is not a benign substance. We know that has some risk. I think we as an industry need to be open to be able to also having that conversation. Let's actually properly understand the risks, right, that are associated with cannabis, because you lack complete credibility when you're coming from a one-way perspective in terms of how great everything is, and certainly there's a number of great things, but I also think we need to be receptive to learning about some of the risks, right? And that's where countries like Canada are doing a lot of work in terms of gathering data. What has the impact been to driving? What's the impact been underage access? And it's there's pros and cons there. I think generally things are moving really well, but there are certain aspects that we may need to tweak, such as age of access. So I think it's important to be receptive and also learn from others in this industry.
I agree 100%. There's something, I call it the educated decision. So we should enable an educated decision, and that's only possible if you know all different aspects.
I mean, there are a lot of studies from all over, all the time, constantly, going back 20, 30, almost 40 years, showing the efficacy of cannabis. And I think when you're dealing with the scientists, you maybe want to get these studies into their hands, but also, it's just an uphill battle. You got to fight 80 years of propaganda every time, and it's so, you have to go so individually. There's no magic wand that you can wave and everybody will get it right away, but if it were easy, I guess it would be done already.
All right, we have 2 more minutes.
You have 2 more minutes. Would you like to sing a song?
No, but maybe we have one more question.
Okay, we have one more question. Derek always asks good
I'm not
questions.
such a good singer, so I don't know.
As an exception, I don't have a question, but I do feel it as a challenge because John dumped on the Dutch and I'm Dutch. So the point you make is true. Most of the coffee shop weed's not tested at all, but I think people should understand it's actually forbidden by law for a coffee shop to get the weed tested. So, and there are some coffee shops, they started about 4 or 5 years ago, basically illegitimately. So illegally having the weed tested, but they still do it because they want to have that service for the customer. So it's not that they don't want it; it's that they cannot do it.
It's one of these. So my brother actually lives in the Netherlands, and it wasn't until I went over there and I was like, oh shit, this is how it works. But it's like for me it was like, oh, maybe they sell weed in the Netherlands. Maybe we'll put a lab here. I'm like, no, you can't even test. Like it was just such a mind blowing experience to me that years people have been coming to these coffee shops. Years. The amount of times I hear right now that's like, if I could get my hands on that original skunk seed from Amsterdam, cross it with my ice cream cake and my gelato, I've got fire. We're still looking back at the Netherlands as these like the pyramids. Like it's like, wow, how did they build these things? Like, wow, this is amazing. But yet today it's like Egypt's not even part of the global economy as what we're doing all the rest of these things. Yet we're looking back to these things. That's what I'm worried about with the Netherlands. It's like you had this point, and you could have literally been the spot that everything became the jump point. Like, could I give me the same?
Don't rub it in there, John.
Oh no, I'm gonna rub it in. I told you I'm gonna dunk on you.
But, do the Dutch really want that? Like the Dutch like to be quiet.
But here's the thing.
They like to be quiet and cool. They don't necessarily want to be. Oh, look at us, we're Dutch weed.
Imagine just take.
That's not really their vibe.
Imagine if you put as much effort into chrysanthemum studies as you did cannabis. I would have no job. I would not be here. So you guys could do it. Thank you.
All right, let's give a round of applause for the panel.
Let's hear it again for our panel. Always fantastic. We love Lisa Hogg so much. This is the International Cannabis Business Conference Berlin 2024.